Before he died, he left behind a list that shocked the world, a list no one expected from the man who wrote 1984, a man who warned humanity about the dangers of surveillance and political manipulation. Yet here he was, secretly naming names to the British government, quietly pointing out writers, journalists, and public figures he believed were untrustworthy. For decades, this file was buried deep inside MI5 archives. And when it surfaced, it shattered the clean, heroic image that George Orwell had always carried in the public imagination. But that is not the only secret he kept. Behind the sharp, uncompromising voice of his novels was a man wrestling with contradictions so intense they bordered on tragic, the champion of the oppressed who also harbored private resentments, the lover of freedom who became entangled with intelligence networks, the man whose love affairs were as turbulent as the political storms he wrote about, the man who lived in poverty but wrote about power, the man who claimed to hate propaganda, yet crafted one of the darkest cultural myths of the 20th century. No one talks about the letter he sent just months before his death, the one that revealed his deepest fear about the world he was leaving behind. No one talks about the final conversations with friends who insisted Orwell was hiding something. Something heavy, something he didn't want the world to see. And almost no one knows the full story of the betrayals that defined his friendships, his politics, and even his marriage. Tonight, we'll open that door. This is not a biography. This is the secret life of George Orwell. His MI5 file, his forbidden loves, his political contradictions, and the shadows that followed him until the end. The truths he carried, the lies he told, the ghosts he tried to outrun. George Orwell was not born with that name. He created it, shaped it, wore it like armor. Behind the pen name was Eric Arthur Blair, a sickly child raised between two worlds, the decaying pride of the British Empire and the harsh realities he witnessed far from home. He grew up with a strange kind of loneliness, the kind that comes from seeing through illusions too early. Even his childhood writings reveal a mind already attuned to hypocrisy, already sensitive to the invisible lines of class, power, and cruelty. When he joined the Imperial Police in Burma, he stepped into the machinery of an empire he would later condemn. But at the time, he was young, idealistic, eager to belong. When he walked the streets with his service revolver and uniform, he thought he could preserve order. What he saw instead was the machinery of oppression working from the inside. He watched lies become law. He watched fear become obedience. And he felt himself becoming part of it. Years later, he described it as wearing a mask for too long until the mask becomes your face. It is during these years that the first cracks in Orwell's identity began to form, the conflict between who he was and what he was doing. This inner fracture would later become the foundation of Animal Farm in 1984. He left Burma broken by guilt and disgust, returning to Europe as a man who did not yet know how to explain the truth he had witnessed. In Paris and London, he embraced poverty with a strange and almost ritualistic devotion. He worked as a dishwasher, slept in cold rooms, lived among beggars and outcasts, believing that only through suffering could he understand the world honestly. To some, this looked noble. To others, those who knew him personally, it seemed like a form of self-punishment. He returned home not as a repentant officer, but as a writer determined to peel away illusions. As the 1930s unfolded, Europe trembled beneath rising authoritarian ideologies. Orwell, restless and disillusioned, traveled to Spain to fight in the Civil War. Officially, he joined the anti-fascist forces. Unofficially, he entered a battlefield where betrayal was more common than bullets. He witnessed friends turn on each other, factions betray their allies, and propaganda distort truth faster than he could write it down. One night, after escaping an ambush set not by the enemy but by supposed comrades, he realized that political purity was a myth. And so were the heroes people desperately believed in. This disillusionment would later color everything he wrote. Animal Farm was not only an allegory about Stalinism. It was a mourning song for the comrades he saw betrayed. 1984 was not just a warning about totalitarianism. It was a vision shaped by the treachery he witnessed among those who were supposed to fight for freedom. Yet while his public work gained attention, Orwell's private life was a quiet storm. His marriage to Eileen O'Shaughnessy began with passion and intellectual fire, but wartime, illness, and financial hardship wore it down. Letters from friends hint at disagreements, emotional distance, and painful misunderstandings. At the same time, Orwell engaged in discreet relationships and emotional entanglements that Eileen increasingly resented but tolerated, sometimes with profound sadness. Her death in 1945 devastated him. Some say he never recovered. Others believe her loss unanchored him, making him reckless with both health and relationships. What is certain is that after Eileen's death, Orwell threw himself into writing with ferocity, producing 1984 while battling tuberculosis, exhaustion, and grief. He wrote as if outrunning death, each sentence sharper, darker, more prophetic. But while the world saw a writer creating a masterpiece, a quieter truth unfolded behind closed doors. During this period, Orwell became more involved with British intelligence circles. He knew journalists, agents, and figures who straddled both literature and espionage. Some were friends, some were rivals. In 1949, he secretly gave the British government a list of writers and artists he believed sympathetic to communist ideology. The file remained hidden for half a century. When it finally surfaced, the world was stunned. Not only at the existence of the list, but at the names on it and at Orwell's private remarks about them. To some, it was proof of betrayal. To others, it was evidence of deeper fears he never admitted publicly. A man tormented by the very forces he wrote about. A man trying desperately to navigate a world where he no longer knew who he could trust. This is the world in which our story takes place. A writer battling illness, haunted by guilt, and caught between competing loyalties. A man whose public voice was clear and uncompromising, while his private life was full of shadows. A man revered for exposing lies, yet hiding his own. A man whose prophetic novels came from wounds far deeper than the world ever understood. George Orwell's rise did not come with applause. It came with coughs, rejections, long nights in freezing rooms, and manuscripts that no one wanted to publish. In his early 30s he was still drifting, still searching for a voice powerful enough to carry the truths he wanted to reveal. Yet beneath the uncertainty, something was forming. A direction. A conviction. A fire. His first books were modest, but they revealed a writer obsessed with honesty. Down and Out in Paris and London showed the world what poverty looked like without romanticism. Burmese Days exposed the hypocrisy of empire with a sharpness few dared to attempt. With each book, Orwell chipped away at the comfortable illusions society protected. Still, fame eluded him. The turning point arrived with the Spanish Civil War. Orwell went there chasing an ideal, but returned with a wound in his throat and a fractured faith in political movements. He had seen too much. Too many betrayals. Too many lies disguised as noble causes. Spain didn't just change him. It marked him. When he returned to England, he was no longer simply a writer. He was a witness to the darkness human beings were capable of when ideology became religion. This experience bled directly into Animal Farm, a manuscript that nearly every major publisher rejected out of fear. One editor even said, "Now is not the time to criticize our ally." But Orwell persisted, knowing he had written something explosive. When it was finally published in 1945, it reshaped his life overnight. Suddenly he had an audience, a global one, a dangerous one. Fame, however, came at a cost. As his reputation grew, so did the pressure. Newspapers demanded his commentary. Publishers begged for more. Political groups watched him with suspicion. Old acquaintances resurfaced. And beneath all this, Orwell's health deteriorated quietly but relentlessly. Tuberculosis gnawed at his lungs. The cough that began in his youth worsened into something he could no longer ignore. But instead of resting, he chose to write the book he believed would define his legacy. He retreated to the Isle of Jura, a remote, desolate landscape of wind, rain, and isolation. To many it seemed like a strange choice. To Orwell, it was the only place where he could escape the noise and write the truth he had carried since Spain. Day after day, he typed with feverish intensity. His lungs burned, his weight dropped, his hands often trembled on the keys. But he wrote, driven by something deeper than ambition. During this period, an unusual series of incidents occurred that few people knew about at the time. Orwell's letters reveal hints of paranoia. He mentioned being watched and strange visitors who came under the guise of friendly check-ins. It is unclear whether this was illness-induced anxiety or a reflection of the political climate, but friends later recalled how he seemed strangely alert, even fearful, whenever strangers approached. Rumors also circulated about his private life. After Eileen's death, Orwell sought romantic companionship, sometimes desperately, sometimes impulsively. He proposed to multiple women in a short span of years, and while some loved him deeply, others questioned his intentions. Letters from women who corresponded with him paint a complex picture of attachment, longing, and confusion. At least one friend claimed Orwell was afraid of dying alone. Another believed he was searching for someone to raise his adopted son if his illness worsened. But alongside these emotional struggles, a far more controversial event began to unfold. Orwell became increasingly involved with a circle of writers, journalists, and political analysts who operated at the edges of British intelligence. He attended dinners where the conversation blurred the line between literature and espionage. He exchanged information that some considered harmless and others considered dangerous. Out of this network came the infamous list. The list of people Orwell believed to be sympathetic to communist ideology. A list he gave the government quietly, privately, with a caution he did not express in public. This was the unusual incident that marked the escalation of the shadow life he lived. He continued writing 1984 through bouts of coughing blood, through nights of fever, through the loneliness of Jura. Those who visited him were shocked at his physical decline. Yet he pushed forward, pouring everything he had left into a novel that felt less like fiction and more like a final warning. When 1984 was published, Orwell was already fading. The book became an instant cultural earthquake. Readers were terrified. Politicians were alarmed. Scholars were amazed. The world called it genius. But Orwell viewed it as something else. A confession of what he feared humanity was becoming. Shortly after the book's success, he suffered a severe collapse. He was moved to a hospital in London, but by then, the illness had sunk too deep. His strength was nearly gone. Even in his final weeks, he received visits from journalists, politicians, and intelligence figures curious about his insights, his experiences, and perhaps even his secrets. What they did not know was that in addition to the literary legacy he had carved, he had left behind something else: files, letters, names, observations that would remain hidden for decades. His fall was quiet. No dramatic farewell. Just a slow fading of breath, accompanied by a legacy the world believed it understood. But understanding Orwell meant looking beyond the books, beyond the brilliance, into the hidden conflicts that fueled his greatest works. And those conflicts were only beginning to come to light long after George Orwell's death, long after his ashes were laid beneath the cold English soil. A locked folder sat untouched in the archives of the British government. For years, only a handful of people knew of its existence. Fewer still knew what was inside. When it was finally opened decades later, scholars, journalists, and readers found themselves staring at something that contradicted the mythology built around him. Inside the MI5 folder was a handwritten list, a list Orwell had secretly compiled in the late 1940s. A list of people he believed were fellow travelers, individuals whose political leanings, associations, or comments made him suspicious: actors, writers, broadcasters, poets, people he chatted with at parties. People who once shared cigarettes with him after long journalistic assignments. People he admired. People he resented. People who had never imagined they would one day be evaluated like potential threats by the author who warned the world about surveillance and censorship. The discovery stunned everyone. How could the man who wrote 1984, the fiercest opponent of authoritarian intrusion, have participated in something that looked uncomfortably close to what his own novels condemned? Betrayal, hypocrisy, fear. These were the accusations that flew across newspaper headlines when the file was made public. But to understand the list, one must understand the man who wrote it. Orwell was not a cold bureaucrat. He was not a spy with a calculating mind. He was a man scarred by the Spanish Civil War, a man who had watched friends murdered not by fascists but by rival factions on his own side. He had seen promises turn to purges. He had witnessed trust turn to ashes. And that trauma followed him into every political discussion he ever had afterward. Letters from those years reveal a man increasingly suspicious of ideological masks. He wrote privately to friends about wolves hiding among sheep, about political serpents who corrupted movements from within. Yet he also feared being manipulated, feared falling for propaganda again, feared being blindsided, as he had been in Spain. The list, in his mind, was not a tool of oppression. It was a shield, a warning, a desperate attempt to protect society from repeating the horrors he had lived through. But the world did not know that when the folder was opened. They saw only the contradiction, the shock, the crack in Orwell's moral armor. Newspaper opinion columns exploded with accusations. Some argued he was more complex than the simplified hero created after his death. Others insisted he was a traitor to his own ideals. Scholars debated motives, context, trauma, illness. Biographers rewrote chapters. Political groups seized the revelation to validate their own narratives. Meanwhile, another truth simmered beneath the surface. Orwell's secret life was not limited to politics. During his final years, friends and acquaintances recalled his tangled emotional world. There were passionate letters exchanged with women far younger than him. There were moments of intensity, deep longing, and confusion. There were relationships he tried to keep hidden, perhaps out of respect for his late wife, perhaps out of shame, perhaps simply out of fear of judgment. Some women remembered him as deeply tender and vulnerable. Others remembered him as restless, demanding, or inconsiderate. He was a man trying to fill an emotional void, knowing time was running out. One of the most haunting memories comes from a friend who visited him in the hospital toward the end. She said Orwell held her hand and whispered that he feared becoming the very thing he warned the world about. He feared his own mind. He feared how illness and isolation had warped his judgment. He feared that paranoia had gotten the better of him. "I sometimes wonder," he murmured, "if I have already helped build the world I feared." Those words, spoken quietly in a dim hospital room, reshaped the way some scholars understood his final years. They saw a man tormented not by ambition, but by responsibility. A man afraid of the consequences of his own voice. A man who believed the world was on the edge of becoming a nightmare and felt powerless to stop it. The revelation of the MI5 list was the climax of this hidden conflict. It exposed the fragile line between vigilance and fear, between protection and betrayal, between principle and desperation. Public reaction was swift and polarized. Some betrayed readers swore they would never look at Animal Farm the same way again. Others claimed the list proved Orwell was even more prophetic, because he understood, on an intimate level, how easily political fear could corrupt even the most principled individuals. Popular magazines ran sensational headlines. Literary critics filled pages with heated commentary. Radio programs debated whether Orwell should remain a cultural icon or be re-examined entirely. Yet through all the noise, something quietly profound emerged. The scandal forced the world to see Orwell not as a saint, not as a prophet, but as a human being. A man shaped by war, illness, grief, and idealism. A man who struggled to reconcile his experiences with his convictions. A man who tried, and sometimes failed, to protect the truth he held sacred. This emotional peak, this dark revelation, cast a new light on his novels. The paranoia of 1984 seemed more personal. The bitterness of Animal Farm felt more intimate. The political intensity of his essays appeared less like intellectual theory and more like the cries of someone who had been wounded deeply. In the end, the secret file did not erase Orwell's legacy. It complicated it, deepened it, humanized it. It pulled back the veil on a life more conflicted, more painful, and far more compelling than the world ever imagined. When we look at George Orwell through the lens of time, through the layers of myth and controversy, through the testimonies of those who knew him and the secrets that surfaced decades later, something becomes clear. He was not the unshakable icon that history tried to carve out of him. He was a man, deeply fragile, fiercely committed, and at times overwhelmed by the very shadows he tried to expose. From the perspective of our channel, which examines famous writers and their works with honesty and respect, Orwell's life forms a paradox that is both troubling and illuminating. On one hand, he remains a towering figure in literature, someone whose novels reshaped the political imagination of entire generations. His contributions are undeniable. He gave us language for ideas we could not articulate. He warned us of dangers that still haunt our modern world. He created metaphors so powerful that they became part of everyday speech. But at the same time, we cannot ignore the cracks in his legacy. The MI5 list, the political anxieties, the quiet betrayals, the complicated love affairs, and the fear that consumed him toward the end. Many people want their heroes to be clean and simple, but Orwell's truth is not simple. It is messy, uncomfortable, and deeply human. That is what makes his story so compelling. We believe that confronting these imperfections does not diminish his work. Instead, it enriches it. It allows readers to see the real emotional and psychological struggles that fed into the creation of Animal Farm and 1984. These books were not born in a clean room of pure theory. They came from scars, from fear, from betrayal, from moments of clarity carved out of chaos. And understanding this gives the novels new depth, a new weight, a new sense of urgency. It also raises provoking questions about the nature of morality in times of political upheaval. Orwell's choices may not align with modern expectations, but they reflect a time when loyalties were blurred, when ideological wars seeped into friendships and families, when everyone lived in fear of choosing the wrong side. It is easy to judge him from a distance. It is harder to understand the desperation that shaped his decisions. Our channel sees Orwell not as a martyr nor as a villain, but as a warning about the complexity of conviction. He is proof that even those who dedicate their lives to truth can fall prey to their own shadows. Even those who dissect propaganda can be manipulated by trauma and fear. Even those who condemn censorship can participate in it under certain conditions. His life forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Can a flawed man still produce timeless truths? Can a person commit actions we disagree with and still leave behind a legacy that protects future generations? How much of what we call hypocrisy is actually the result of pain that the world never witnessed? We now turn these questions back to you, the viewer. How do you see Orwell after hearing this? Do his secrets change the way you read his books? Do his contradictions make him more human or more troubling? Do his struggles make his warnings more powerful or less sincere? We would love to know your impressions, your interpretations, your disagreements. Literature has always been a conversation, not a verdict. And stories like Orwell's remind us why these conversations are necessary. In the end, George Orwell remains a figure suspended between light and shadow. A man who spent his life exposing lies, yet carried his own. A man who stood against tyranny, yet participated in quiet acts that blurred the boundaries he fought so hard to define. Perhaps that is why his presence lingers so powerfully in our cultural memory. Not because he was perfect, but because he was struggling. Relentlessly, painfully, honestly. To understand a world that seemed determined to destroy itself. When we read Orwell today, something strange happens. His words feel older than the 20th century, yet sharper than the present moment. His warnings echo through modern headlines. His fears whisper beneath political debates. His visions of surveillance and manipulation feel almost prophetic. And when we know the secrets he carried, the novels become even more haunting. The pain becomes personal. The fear becomes intimate. The darkness becomes real. You can almost imagine him late at night on Jura, coughing into a handkerchief stained with blood, typing against time. Outside, the wind would rattle the windows. Inside, the dim lamp would cast shadows that stretched across the room like silent witnesses. He knew he was dying. He knew the world was changing. He knew he had one final chance to say something that mattered. And so he poured everything into a book that still chills the human spirit. And yet, despite the shadows in his life, there were moments of extraordinary tenderness. The way he wrote about simple decency. The way he defended the powerless. The way he believed, against all evidence, that truth could still save us if we had the courage to speak it. These remnants of hope shine even brighter once we understand the battles he fought inside himself. Some stories were never meant to be known. But now you know. And knowing does not break the spell. It deepens it. It invites you to look again at the man behind the manuscripts, to see the tremor in his voice, the weight in his steps, the wounds behind the warnings. Knowing his secrets makes him less of a monument and more of a mirror. It reminds us that even those who change the world are vulnerable, flawed, human. Orwell's legacy does not rest on purity. It rests on honesty, on the raw force of a man trying to find clarity in the fog, on the courage to write what frightened him, on the recognition that truth is never simple, never clean, never without cost. And perhaps that is why he still matters, because somewhere in the quiet spaces of his work, beneath the fear and fury, lies a single fragile hope he never abandoned, the hope that if we see clearly, ourselves, our world, our shadows, we might yet choose a better path. Some stories were never meant to be known. But now you know.